I am so excited to have you with me today because we are diving into one of the most fascinating, complex, and honestly morally ambiguous true crime stories in human history. We're traveling all the way back to 17th century Italy to uncover the wild story of Giulia Tofana and her incredibly secretive, highly organized underground poison network. And, this isn't just a story about a deadly concoction. It is a really profound look at what happens when desperate people are completely backed into a corner by society.
All right, let's quickly map out exactly what we're covering today. First, the 17th century patriarchal trap. Then, the untraceable poison Aqua Tofana. We'll look at the secret underground affiliate network, the fatal drop of soup, unequal justice for the wealthy, and finally, we'll ask, serial killer or savior? We're going to see how sociology, chemistry, economics, and the law all collided in this historical case. Moving right into part one, the 17th century patriarchal trap. Because to really understand this poison, we first have to understand the suffocating environment that created the demand for it in the first place. So our story actually kicks off in Palermo, Sicily, where Giulia was born in 1620. Her mom was an apothecary, so she was highly skilled in making perfumes, cosmetics, and herbal medicines. Giulia basically grew up surrounded by the sheer power of chemistry, but she also grew up witnessing the absolute brutality of the justice system. In 1633, when Giulia was literally just 13 years old, her mother was publicly executed after being accused of poisoning her own husband. Talk about a traumatic formative experience, right? It embedded in Giulia this deep knowledge of chemical mixtures, but also a firsthand understanding of how desperate a woman's plight could be in this era. Look at it this way. Back in 17th century Italy, women were essentially treated as property. First, you were owned by your father, then by your husband. And divorce? Yeah, that was a privilege strictly reserved for the ultra-wealthy. For your everyday average woman, there were virtually no safe paths in life. If you didn't marry, your options were basically to become a nun, beg on the streets, or turn to sex work just to survive. Because those options were so bleak, countless women were forced into marriages that quickly turned violently abusive. And what's truly heartbreaking is what happened when these abused women actually tried to get help. If you went to the authorities to report that your husband was beating you, you were routinely given this devastating advice. Be more patient, submit to your husband, and try harder to please him so you won't be hit. Society just flat out told them to submit. The legal system offered zero protection. They were entirely, utterly trapped. Which brings us to part two, the untraceable poison, Aqua Tofana. Let's see how Giulia provided a deeply illicit yet incredibly effective workaround to this systemic nightmare. As Giulia grew older, she refined her mother's apothecary skills and started taking her own clients. Hearing these horrific stories of abuse from local women, she developed a lethal concoction she called Aqua Tofana. But the sheer genius here was in the packaging. Giulia disguised this deadly poison as a completely benign cosmetic face cream, or even packaged it in small glass bottles with an image of St. Nicholas to look like holy water. I mean, it was brilliant camouflage. No abusive husband was ever going to question an innocent-looking religious item or makeup bottle on his wife's vanity. Now, the pharmacology here is absolutely wild. This blend was a lethal cocktail of antimony, lead, and arsenic. And get this, she actually sourced the arsenic from a priest named Father Girolamo. But what made Aqua Tofana the ultimate weapon was that it was totally colorless and completely tasteless. Even crazier for the time, it left absolutely no trace in the body. If a doctor performed an autopsy, the poison would have just evaporated or dispersed. It completely baffled the medical experts of the era. And Giulia didn't just hand over a bottle and say good luck. She provided her clients with a very strict multi-step playbook. It only took about 5 or 6 drops total. A tiny first dose slipped into the husband's drink would just cause sudden fatigue. A few days later, dose number 2 would trigger stomach aches, vomiting, and severe dysentery. By the time that 3rd or 4th dose hit, the husband's body would just shut down entirely. Here is the absolute kicker. By spacing the poison out like this, it perfectly mimicked the natural, slow-acting illnesses that were already everywhere in the 17th century. And even better for the wives, this slow decline gave these dying husbands time to get their affairs in order. They could write their wills, ensure their families were financially provided for, and eventually pass away without ever suspecting their wives of foul play. The widows could even demand autopsies to prove their innocence, knowing full well the poison would never be found. All right, part 3, the secret underground affiliate network. Because Giulia definitely wasn't distributing this to hundreds of women all by herself. She built a distribution model that actually looks surprisingly modern.
We are talking about over 200 affiliates. Giulia built this massive, secretive network made up of apothecaries, friends, and even sympathetic priests. It became this incredible whisper network that spread the secret of Aqua Tofana way beyond Palermo, expanding all the way into Naples and Rome.
It operated like a highly exclusive, almost Robin Hood-style cartel. She didn't just sell to anyone off the street. You had to be a woman in desperate need, and you had to be personally vetted by Giulia herself or highly recommended by a trusted affiliate. And what's really fascinating here is the cross-class solidarity. Giulia had clients who were insanely wealthy noblewomen, right? Well, she used the massive profits from those rich clients to fund free distribution for the poorest, most severely abused women who couldn't pay. It created this unbreakable, ironclad code of silence across all social classes. They were actively protecting each other.
But moving to part 4, the fatal drop of soup. The system was flawless, and it ran perfectly for years. But human panic is just totally unpredictable. And in 1650, one split second of hesitation brought the entire empire crashing down.
Picture this. A young woman had bought Aqua Tofana and laced her abusive husband's soup with it. But right as she watched him lift the spoon to his mouth, this wave of guilt and terror just washed over her. She completely panicked and screamed, "Wait, don't eat that! Let me get you a new one!" Well, her husband, who was already a naturally abusive and suspicious guy, instantly knew something was up. He violently beat his wife until she finally broke down and confessed everything, including the fact that she bought the poison from a woman named Giulia Tofana. He dragged her straight to the authorities, which triggered a massive manhunt. Giulia actually heard the police were coming and fled to a nearby church to claim sanctuary. Unfortunately for her, the authorities simply did not care about church sanctuary. Rumors started flying that Giulia had poisoned the local water supply, so they stormed the church, dragged her out, and subjected her to horrific torture. And under that brutal interrogation, the confession she gave was absolutely staggering. Between 1633 and 1651, she had sold enough Aqua Tofana to eliminate at least 600 toxic husbands. 600. And honestly, historians think that is probably a very conservative estimate. So let's look at part 5, unequal justice for the wealthy. Because the fallout from this massive revelation starkly highlights the immense legal inequalities of the time. Once Giulia confessed, the deeply rigged nature of the justice system was put on full display. Giulia, along with her lower-class clients and affiliates, were brutally interrogated and publicly executed. But the wealthy wives of conglomerates and noblemen, the very women who practically bankrolled the whole operation, they used their status and money to completely evade the law. A few were briefly imprisoned, some got quietly exiled, but many faced literally zero consequences. The law was just heavily rigged against the poor, right up to the very end. Which brings us to our final section, Part 6, Serial Killer or Savior. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of this entire explainer. How exactly are we supposed to view Giulia Tofana today? To really understand her impact, just look at what happened after she died. Even after Giulia was executed, the desperation was so high in Italy that her stepdaughter, Girolama Spara, actually took over the deadly network. She kept the whole thing running successfully for almost another decade before she was caught and executed in 1659. The sheer demand for an escape from these marriages simply never faded.
So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder based on everything we've unpacked. On one hand, she objectively facilitated the murder of hundreds of people, period. But on the other, she provided literally the only existing escape hatch for women facing daily torture with absolutely no legal recourse. As an impartial explainer, I'm not here to take a side, but rather to ask you,
How do you judge a crime when the law itself offers absolutely no justice? It is a fascinating historical dilemma. Thank you so much for joining